Good morning. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar. My name is Carmen Boone, Education Coordinator from Oregon Pacific Area Health Education Center, a hosted agency of Samaritan Lebanon Community Hospital. Our agency mission is to promote access to quality healthcare through community and educational partnerships. Today, I will be your host and moderator. Let's go over some housekeeping items. Please mute your microphones and unmute them to answer questions. Use the chat box for typing questions or comments at any time. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on your YouTube channel. If you have any questions, please email me at the address that you see on your screen. To obtain CME or CA credit, please log into www.eeds.com and enter this activity code. Please write it down and consider that the activity code expires in 1 week. We will email you these instructions and the link today within 2 hours after the webinar. This presentation is jointly provided by Samaritan Health Services, Oregon AHEC, Oregon Health and Science University, and Oregon Pacific Area Health Education Center. The presenters and the planners of this activity report that we have no conflicts of interest or relevant financial relationships with any commercial entities that might affect the contents of this presentation. Today, our presenters are Dr. Tina Runyan and Dr. John Fleischman. They are both clinical psychologists with backgrounds in academic medicine and integrated behavioral health. Through their work as directors of behavioral health programs in family medicine residencies, they identified a need for better mental health and well-being support for clinicians. In 2020, they founded 10th Health to focus on providing specialized and accessible mental health care to healthcare professionals. 10th Health offers mental health care in 9 states, including Oregon and Washington. They are passionate about clinician well-being and consult with healthcare organizations to improve well-being and reduce barriers to care. Now, without further ado, I'll leave you with Tina and Joan.
Thank you, Carmen. I'm just noting as I'm trying to share my screen that it is not allowing me. You may have to end sharing your screen for me to do it.
Yes.
Thanks.
There we go.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, sorry about that. All right, good morning, everyone. Oh, Joan, do you want to try to share? I'm getting an error.
Yeah, let me do that.
Google is not connecting this morning.
Yeah, well, we can kind of start and I'll get this up.
Yep. So thank you, Carmen. Welcome. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the kind introduction. I think that we probably have folks who have been with us before, but we always love to have folks chat in and let us know who you are and where you're joining from. So please feel free to take a moment to do that. Just wake up your body, wake up your fingertips, chatting in. It's an early morning on the West Coast, but it's early in the morning on the West Coast. So we are joining you for a point in our series. We've been doing a series of workshops, and we are in the second part. We can go to the next. I won't be able to move the slides.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. So, yep. So we are doing this series. We're in the middle of a series 2, which is a focus on mindful practice and communication. And today's presentation is really going to be a focus on leaders in a prolonged crisis, a call for compassionate leadership. And we invite you to join us actually next week. My apologies, this slide has a date error on it. Next week is going to be our practice lab for compassionate leadership. So this is one we usually are 2 weeks apart, but I am happy to announce that we changed the date because my oldest, my son, is graduating college on May 20th. So that is our conflict. And so we will be doing the practice lab on May 13th next week. And we invite you to join us for that. And then in June, we will have a series again with a 2-week gap between our presentation and our practice lab. And there we're going to be really, in some ways, taking a deeper dive into a lot of the topics we'll be presenting today, really focusing on mindful communication and managing difficult conversations, whether those are in a hierarchical relationship or with patients or with other people in your life outside of your professional life, and in some ways, even with oneself. So that's kind of where we are in the geography of this, this landscape of presentations we've been doing with you. We can go to the next slide. And as Carmen mentioned, while we are coming to you from Tend Health, where we are extremely passionate and dedicated to enhancing the well-being of healthcare organizations and mostly the individuals within those organizations, we are not selling anything today, and our affiliation with Tend Health does not in any way bias the content of this presentation. Next slide. So compassion in healthcare, we expect it towards patients and families, and in many healthcare organizations, you will find the word compassion often somewhere, maybe in the vision or the mission statement or the values. Almost every healthcare organization will have that, and often it is an outward-facing value, and it's an expectation that is baked into the organization that we as healthcare clinicians will offer compassion to families, to patients, to our communities. But often there is not a very intentional inward focus on that and focus on compassion towards the people working in those institutions. So this is really the rub that we're going to be talking about today, is thinking about compassion as a leadership value, not just outward facing in healthcare organizations, but really how does a leader provide that internal to the organization? So we thought we would start, again, we like to present and teach and learn all together. So we thought we would start with an inquiry to you all and invite you to think about a leader who you really admire, respect, perhaps somebody who has led you directly, or maybe just somebody that you know of and you almost sort of pine for, like, oh, I wish my boss were a little more like that. And I want you to think about the qualities or characteristics that you attribute to this person. So not to name the person or their title, but think about, when you think about that person, what are the qualities that you're tapping into that you feel like make them a really good leader? And we invite you to put that in the chat. If we can get some conversation going in the chat about what are these characteristics of leadership that you most admire and respond to. Yeah, people who take time to listen, deep and generous listening, patience. Great. Keep them coming. Thank you for sharing these. The difference between what might be said kind of in memos and emails and platitudes and actually what is modeled, the actual behavior. Relatable. Yeah, not too distant from who they're leading. Great. approachable, caring, fair. Respect. Yeah. I'm guessing you mean sort of that they demonstrate respect. They show respect to people that they are leading. Great. Yes. Good. Yeah. So this thoughtful, somebody who sees all sides, which is not unrelated to what somebody said is sort of being willing to listen. So Roma said when people take time to listen, and those are connected, right? In order to see all sides, you have to be willing to drop in to listening to be able to get that perspective. Genuine interest. Yeah. Who actually wants to know about not just what you're producing for them, but a little bit about you and who you are. Great. We can go to the next slide. So we're going to be using, I think, some of these concepts and building on some of these concepts of what you all shared when we talk about compassionate leadership. It's just notable that what came out in that list was not authority, was not, the aspects of leadership that I think historically have been promulgated around how do you be a good leader, right? You have to be bold, you have to be courageous, you have to be, really unwavering in your message. You have to have those kind of hard characteristics in a sense. And I just want to note that a lot of what was shared here is what we might consider more on the softer side, not that they are soft, but that we might consider that. So we're going to talk about the fundamental principles of compassionate leadership, distinguish between helpful and unhelpful displays of vulnerability as a leader, and hopefully see the sense of being a compassionate leader doesn't mean not having any guardrails. In fact, those can be pretty clear and pretty strong, but it's sort of what happens in the middle. And then looking at strategies for asking for and receiving feedback from people that you lead. So that's kind of where we're headed. We'll go to the next slide. And I can't move into this space of talking about leadership in healthcare without first acknowledging sort of what I started with, which is the culture of healthcare. And so some of you may know this little parable that George Wallace delivered a commencement speech in 2005, and it became quite famous. He started the commencement speech with this story of one morning there were two young fish swimming in the water, enjoying their morning swim, and an older fish swam by them in the other direction and said, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two little fish swam on a little bit longer side by side, and eventually one of them looked to the other and said, "What's water?" And it was a commentary around sometimes the most obvious things are the things that can be hardest to talk about, and sometimes the most obvious things that really begin to affect us, we become invisible to us, and we're not really paying attention to the culture. So we can go to the next slide. And just this reminder that in all organizations, healthcare organizations included, that culture eats strategy, right? For breakfast is sort of the quote, culture eats strategy. So you can have all of the trainings or like the platitudes or the memos saying, that have something to do with being respectful and listening to one another and being fair and being caring and being reliable. But if the culture does not support that, if the water we swim in is toxic, right? Even if it's not completely visible to us, right? Even if it's invisible toxins, if that's the water that we're swimming in, it doesn't matter that there's messaging or trainings or education or imperatives to behave in these ways if the culture is not emulating those, if the culture is not supporting those. And my experience in some of the healthcare institutions that I have worked in, it really has been that for all the talk about being compassionate and kind and respectful and fair and listening and wanting all of those things to be delivered outward to patients and to the community, there's very little evidence of that being attended to and modeled within the organization, within the institution. And so when we talk about compassionate leadership, that's really what we're talking about. We can go to the next slide. And around what is compassionate leadership.
Can I make a note about that though? I think sometimes it can feel futile, right? If you're in a system that feels like there's some toxicity or some cultural pieces that kind of go against the grain of a lot of what we've talked about in these series, I think what is important to remember is that we as individuals can make a huge difference in the culture of our teams, in the culture of the people we interact with every day. And we've all experienced that in different settings where there's that one person who brings something to an interaction, brings something to a meeting, or a moment with a patient when you're caring for them together. And it rubs off. And so I think just as we talk through, for all of you who are here today, as we talk through some of these concepts around compassionate leadership and go into some case studies of how to apply the concepts, to remember that you can lead in just one interaction. You can bring these concepts and application into your day-to-day work with patients, with colleagues, with mentors, just by shifting a little bit of the language, shifting a little bit of the stance. So there's hope. And I think sometimes it can feel hard, like we're swimming upstream in medical settings. So just want to say that.
Yeah, it's a beautiful reminder for all of my Debbie Downer in terms of culture and healthcare, that we may not have an official title, right, of a leader, but we can all lead in various ways. And just because we can't do everything doesn't mean we can't do anything. Yeah, so thank you for that reminder. So what is compassionate leadership? It's the intention to contribute to happiness and well-being. So that should not be a surprise, because we've talked about compassion in this series before, right? This idea that compassion is kind of recognizing some suffering, attending to it, aligning with it, understanding that that's an uncomfortable state, and having some wish or desire to alleviate that is the sense of what compassion is. And leaders actually have this additional component of agency, potentially, to be able to do that. So a compassionate leader represents most of what was coming up in the chat, a genuine interest in seeing people perform, not just perform, but to thrive. So the question is how to do that. What are these elements of compassionate leadership? We can go to the next slide. So here are some principles of compassionate leadership. And again, these weave in so well to what we've been covering within this series. So here are 4 components. I'll just define them briefly. The sense of self-awareness, of really being able to step outside oneself as a leader and be able to observe the self in these situations, in micro interactions, sort of with one person, but also on a macro level, kind of be able to know what is driving oneself and motivating oneself at any given time, and where that's coming from, that deep connection with oneself. Sense of empathy, which is that perspective. Somebody said, right, being able to see all perspectives, that idea that you have a genuine desire to understand and be in other people's perspectives and other people's shoes. Self-compassion. So this idea of how do you treat yourself as a leader when things aren't going well? Oftentimes in leadership, it's not, our qualities and our essence of leadership is less defined by how we are when things are going well, and much more defined by how we are when things aren't going well. And so how do we meet ourselves in those moments. And compassionate leaders have a deep ability to be compassionate towards themselves and recognize this correlation between my tendency to judge myself actually will show up in how I treat other people, and vice versa. So that deep well of compassion applying not only to others, but to oneself. And then this aspect of not knowing, being willing to drop into a place, and this can be very hard for leaders oftentimes because the expectation, perhaps by others and certainly by self, is to have the answer. And so compassionate leaders can really hold a stance of not knowing, of staying curious. That deep capacity, that skill around listening is really powerful in this space, because they can acknowledge that not only is it okay to not have the answer, it actually might be much more advantageous to be in that stance for some period of time of not knowing, because you're collecting a lot of information that can allow you to make a decision, not just from one perspective, but from multiple perspectives. So when we talk about the components of compassionate leadership, these are the elements that we're talking about, and they reflect so well to what you all put in the chat when you just thought about a leader that you admired. You know, it didn't come from this place, this other perspective around what you need to be a leader in terms of some of the classic traits we've come to think of as what it means to be a good leader. So we'll transition to the next slide and talk about some myths of compassionate leadership and some barriers to compassionate leadership. Joan?
So I think that there's, we put a few on the slide here, but I think there's others too. So thinking about taking this stance in your leadership style or embodying those 4 principles that Tina just talked about, this idea that that's not going to be productive, and that you're not going to be able to have movement or make decisions, that we're just going to kind of stay in the space of listening, which listening itself can be productive, but can also lead to kind of lead down the road to other things. So another myth is really not holding people accountable, that if we're in that stance of empathy and compassion, that we're not able to have to set boundaries or to hold people accountable for what their part of the work is, which again is you can do both. If you bring those characteristics and that approach, it actually feels better as a leader when you are holding someone accountable, when you are asking about a deliverable or productivity, or asking them how they're feeling about their work thus far, their progress thus far in a project. And then not meaning that bottom line, that this is somehow going to affect productivity, affect deliverables, affect someone's or the team's ability to produce or meet that revenue goal. And that is very untrue as well. That these actually, we can see in many companies that have employed more of a compassionate leadership stance, that they're very profitable. So the other things kind of I was thinking about as I was thinking about myths was just this idea that listening, that when we, I think about, okay, what does it mean to be a leader? That sometimes it feels like, oh, well, I'm in charge. Clearly I have authority. And how am I going to practice that? Like, what is that going to look like when I'm interacting with the people that I lead? And so I think about this idea of coming alongside, and we speak about servant leadership in this idea of kind of leading next to. And if you think about different kinds of leadership as kind of leading from above, leading next to, or sometimes a very ineffective leaders kind of leading from below, like being that wishy-washy, like, I don't know, what do you think? Like, can't make a decision, goes back and forth on things. But I think there's this idea of kind of leading from this, like, on alongside and next to, and this idea of what does that look like? So listening can be a superpower. I was just thinking as we were talking through the 4 principles of compassionate leadership around even when there's a situation where there's a very clear answer. So for example, when employees would come to me and ask for an exception to our time off policy, and I knew that I wasn't going to be able to make that exception, because if I was in a union shop, so if I made one exception, first I had to consider our like union contract, but if I had made one exception for an employee, I would have to make an exception for any employee that asked for that. So, but I found that if I would say, I can't do that, like, Janet, I'm sorry, I can't do that, right away, that there was, I could tell that person felt shut down. And I could tell that I think they felt like I didn't even listen. I didn't even hear what was going on. So I would do a lot of, because I wanted to think creatively about, is there anything else I could do? So I would encourage kind of that place of not knowing and saying, I'm not sure, like, let's keep talking, tell me more. Or this is something I'm going to need to think about. What other information can you share with me that might help me kind of make a decision? So really listening, really letting people share what it is that's important to them. And really, when you're listening to them, really listening for what is it that's important to them? What about this situation? Underneath maybe the content of the situation, what are the values that are coming out? And as a leader, even as a colleague, when you're listening to someone, being able to say, I hear that being there for your family is really important to you. Or I hear that making time for your own health is really important to you. Or I hear that going to the Timbers playoffs is really important to you, which is our local soccer team here. So like the idea that maybe I don't value going to the Timbers game, or sports in general, but I'm hearing that and I'm validating that and I'm making that known in our conversation. It's now shared information. And so being able to take the time. So I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but I'm really speaking to that deep listening and empathy, right? Like I may not care about sports, but they clearly do. That's important to them. I can put myself in those shoes. I can respect that. That doesn't mean that I need to say, you know what, totally, you know what, you can have tomorrow afternoon off to go to the game, right? I may not be able to do that. But I'll tell you, those conversations where I left space and time to hear the whole story and validate what was important to them, even if I said no, it felt more collaborative. It felt more collaborative. It felt like I was even coming alongside, even if I had to say, no, I can't, that's not going to work out. And I usually said it's something different than that. But so I think the other piece is deconstructing power, right? This myth of I have the authority, I have more experience than you, and I know what to do in these situations. To actually take that off and go back into that not knowing space and ask what does this person bring to this situation? What do they know that I don't know? What's the perspective that they bring? And deconstructing that power dynamic, and bringing kind of that idea of how do you collaborate on the shared goal? And how do you listen for that shared goal? We're going to talk a little more about this in some case studies, but that's my perspective on kind of the myths of compassionate leadership.
I want to tie that back to this idea that, because the conversations went better when people felt heard, that oftentimes the request is coming from coming up with a strategy to meet that need. And one of the things you're describing in how you would approach that is you're actually dropping down into the need. And then there may be multiple strategies to meet that need. The need is, I need a little more flexibility. The need is, I need a little more time to do X, Y, and Z this week, different than next week. And so they're probably being a very, good employee coming with a potential solution. But when you can drop back into the need, it actually allows you to collaboratively problem solve and maybe come up with a strategy that actually is within the bounds of what you can do, because it's a union shop, but also meets that need because you actually can bring two heads together. And then the reason, this idea about holding people accountable, this is one of the reasons why compassionate leadership requires self-compassion. One of the reasons that we can prematurely shut down conversations, right? This is a great example, Jen, that you brought up, because we might know that the answer is no. If somebody's asking for an exception to something, that may not feel great. And you might actually brace yourself against hearing the need because it puts you in a situation where now they want to be there for their daughter's play and I have to say no, right? And that doesn't feel good. So we can prematurely cut off the conversation instead of dropping into that space where we can understand more about the need, perhaps come up with a strategy, but even when we can't and we have to hold somebody accountable, that's really where self-compassion comes in. To be able to meet oneself, knowing that was a really hard conversation. It was really hard to hold that line. And how are you with yourself in that? So that you can do exactly what you're describing. You don't have to prematurely cut it off, so you don't have to face that messiness internally.
And I would add the self-awareness piece is so important, because if there are understanding what's going on for yourself internally allows you to stay more regulated in whatever situation it is, whether you have to share really good news with your team that they're all getting a bonus, or whether you're running a code or you're responding to a rapid response. It will go so far to just be aware of, oh, wow, I'm going into a dysregulated state. Like, I am getting anxious. What am I anxious about? Okay, I've not done this in a really long time. I don't really know what I'm doing. What can I quickly go back to? What are my tenets here in this whatever situation? Like, where are my anchors? And also in these situations where you're delivering bad news, you're delivering an answer that it may not be favorable to the other party or the team, that can be really dysregulating, because it could be something that goes against your own values. You may be just the face of the information, right? And of course, would I want to let I want to be flexible. I wish that there was more flexibility in these roles that my employees had, and that there was more flex, and there probably is now regarding kind of the things that have changed around COVID. But right now, way back then, there wasn't, and that felt really icky to me. And I also was able to say that this is something that I hope we can work on and change from an institutional level, that there is more flexibility. Right now, there's not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think one of the things that we haven't so much touched on today around vulnerability, but one of the things that comes up a lot in leadership is how do you stay authentic to yourself and show up in a genuine way. And I think someone said that. And I was struck by the words you all put in the chat, because I think they really embody a compassionate leader. And part of showing up authentically is bringing some vulnerability into your relationships, into your approach. So what does that look like? Being able to share a little bit about your own experience or your own self, modeling asking for help, modeling not always knowing the answer or knowing the complete answer, and then really fostering psychological safety and trust, which is probably like its whole a whole presentation on its own, right? Of what does that look like? How do you do that? How do you do that in a team? How do you do that as a team is forming? And so thinking about how do you also use these techniques or kind of ways of being, this approach in the way you give feedback and receive feedback. So were we going to do some Kate? Do you want to say anything more about that?
No, I think let's do some cases, and we're gonna ask for some participation here because we really want to make these concepts sort of applicable and concrete. So I think we have a situation here where you are a leader and you have just taken a couple of days off because you needed to attend to some family issues. And we'll say that there's, sort of sandwich generation. You had some issues you needed to attend to in terms of a child, and then also to address some issues with maybe some older parents. So it wasn't, you weren't on vacation. It was sort of known that there was some family things that you needed to take some time off, and you're back at work. And one of the people that you lead comes and asks you, knocks on the door and says, how are you doing? How were things? How are you now? And to think about, based on these concepts, we're talking about how might you reply and what might come up for you in thinking about that issue around vulnerability and authenticity.
And I'm just going to put the concepts in the chat so we can remember them. So we are curious about how, putting yourself in the shoes of this leader, how would you respond to this person that you lead after coming back from a few days away for caring from a sick child or a aging parent, and to acknowledge that maybe things aren't great. Mm-hmm. Maybe when they're asking you how you are, how you might respond to a friend is not good. Things are not good right now, and I'm overwhelmed or I'm struggling. So how would you respond to your team member that you are their supervisor or manager? And even if you're not a leader in your role right now, you don't have a title that says you're a leader, I'm curious about how you would want your leader to respond, how you would want your manager to respond. Or if that's not in your mind right now, have you had situations like this before with your leader or manager, and how have they responded? And would you have wanted something different, or is there something that was really helpful to you in that? Yes, thank you. So this is an idea of how to respond. Thank you so much for asking. I appreciate that a lot. I'm doing okay. I got a lot accomplished, which was helpful. Still some to do, of course, but that's life, right? So you're kind of like normalizing. How are you doing? Is there anything from my absence that you need from me? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So absolutely some positive reinforcement for checking in, right? giving some, like, I just appreciate you coming by and checking on me. That's super wonderful. And
Sometimes leadership can be so isolating, particularly in a lot of situations, and this is common in healthcare, where people move from a peer or colleague to a next level supervisor. People, demonstrate sort of competency and being really good at this level, and then sort of get to the next level up, and oftentimes then find themselves in situations where they are leading in some capacity for people that they used to be colleagues with, and that can be isolating and confusing. So yeah, a lot of acknowledgement. Mhm. Yeah, I like that idea of this sense of authenticity and vulnerability. The situation is hard, so you're not pretending there. And also this sense of, and we're managing. So I'm not gonna that was very much my experience in a leadership role of trying to figure out where you draw that line. It seemed like drawing it, really close in was sort of contributing to a culture in some ways of everybody being fine and nobody being fine, right? Of like not sharing anything, but drawing it so far out that all the details spill out without discernment was, we've all probably been around people who do that, right? So all the things, and that may not be so helpful either. So that's a really nice balance of being authentic and acknowledging it without all the details. Yeah, Rita's sort of the same. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just like what Teresa is saying about how hard it is to go from colleague to lead, that happens a lot in healthcare as we kind of we kind of move into different roles, and it's reestablishing relationships, because the way we interact with our peers and our colleagues can feel, and in very real ways, be very different from the way we interact when we are holding people accountable and making decisions around their schedule or some things that really can impact their well-being in their life. So thinking about, there's almost like there's like an identity development period where you're re-establishing relationships, and it can be really uncomfortable for both you as the leader and for your colleagues that you're now leading. And it's a delicate balance. I think there's also a delicate balance there.
Yeah.
So maybe we can move into the next one.
Yeah, so the next one is kind of putting your, current leader hat or future leader hat on, and that you have somebody very similar to kind of the case you were saying, Joan, like somebody has to leave or called out because of a sick child. So they don't have a backup system and they have to leave because of childcare. And you are in this situation where you are noticing that you want to be supportive, and you actually have some very imminent tactical things to solve for. So what is your kind of response to that staff person? And alternatively, if you've been in that situation as somebody who's had to call out and do that, the other way to think about this, to have a stance of what would be helpful as a leader, is think, as that person calling out, what do you most want to hear? What do you most want to hear from your leader that would actually help you feel valued, feel committed, and continue to be loyal to this situation, to be somebody that you want to return to work for and with? So you can take either perspective, trying to get at, as a leader, what would you say? And as a staff member, maybe what would you most like to hear?
And this situation would happen a lot in primary care, where we would be where we would have someone who has a very kind of critical role in the clinic, whether it be kind of the front desk person or the MA or the provider, or, you know, kind of like something was going to need to shift. As the leader, I was going to need to, or my colleagues were going to need to kind of figure out, okay, who's going to pick up if that person needs to go home. So it's it also takes some problem solving on the leaders, because that person clearly they're going to be leaving. Like, you're not going to say no, you can't leave. So just curious what your guys' thoughts are about that, what y'all think. Maybe a little bit harder to come up with.
When I think about this concept of self-awareness that you're saying is so important, to recognize that it would be true for me that in that moment, I feel some tightening of my chest, some tensing of the muscles, and I feel sort of put also in an emergent situation where I might have to do more. I might have to ask somebody else to do more in terms of coverage. And to know in that moment, that doesn't feel good. And then the question is how quickly can I register that and understand that, oh, this person is probably feeling that exact same way. They're feeling, I need to do this. This is what I'm supposed to do and attend to this. And I just got tugged over here and I have to go attend to this. That they're actually feeling the exact same way. And might drop into that sense of like, that's what is shared, right, with that person. Like, this is really hard. This is really hard for both of us for different reasons. This is really hard, but not scoot past that. I don't see anything else coming into the chat yet. Oh, here we go. I step into the role of that nurse. Yeah, so you as the leader basically have to cover. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. How I can support them and the team. Mm-hmm.
I think there's two thoughts that I was just having. One is, if this was a pattern with this person, I might not in the moment, like I can imagine feeling frustrated. So having that self-awareness of like, what's coming up for me right now? Like, what am I feeling? What's happening in my body? What is my body language? What is that communicating? And having to temper that with like, yeah, your kid is sick, you need to leave. Like, I also can step into the empathy role, right? That empathy of like, I get it. Like, yes, go take care of what you need to take care of. But what language am I using to say that? Because and what's my tone? Because I could say that in a very kind of angry way, right? Yeah, go leave, bye, see ya, go take care of what you need to take care of. Like, understand, very short, but how do I kind of check that, right? And say, yep, I know, like slow down. Maybe I need to take a few breaths. Maybe I need to check in with myself about what's going on for me. And then be able to have that interaction where I'm not bringing that anger or frustration in. And then maybe it's a follow-up email or a follow-up conversation that we have around, this seems to be happening a lot. Like, is there anything we can do? Do they need a schedule change? Is there any, do they need to apply for intermittent FMLA, which doesn't help me any as the manager because that means they can leave, but it helps with understanding what's going on in the process. But the other piece of this is, is there any way we can set up our team structure or the way that our workflows that it's not so impactful when one person leaves on the rest of the team? Or can we plan for that if that seems to be something that kind of throws all of us off? Or, do I need a float person? Or is there, anyway, I think there's also kind of a responsibility from our side as leaders to think, is there a way to improve this situation so it doesn't feel like a crisis?
I want to pick up on Jesse's comment in the chat as well, which has so much to do with culture, right? And to make the implicit explicit, right? So maybe it is in some ways, and sort of timing. The other piece you're talking about, Joan, is like timing. When is the right time to have certain conversations, right? So if this is a pattern, the time to have that conversation is not, as a compassionate leadership, is not in that moment of crisis, right? But it doesn't mean you don't circle back to that conversation, right? To really then also deeply listen and understand what are the things that this person is juggling outside of here, to see if you can come up with strategies that align better. So the timing piece, and then this sense of modeling the behavior, and also, yes, there's something like, I'm so glad I could cover for you. That's what we do here, right? That's what we do in this team. We do this for one another. And it's just inculcating that like little brief messaging around, yeah, like we all have times where we need someone to have our back, and that we're willing to do that for others when we trust that somebody will have our back. Like there is this willingness to lean in and do this when there is a culture of collectivism and a culture of trust, that I'm happy to step in like this, because I don't know if it's going to be next week. I don't know if it's going to be, 10 weeks from now, but I know I'm going to need a moment too. And I trust that somebody else will step in for me. So kind of making that through modeling for sure. And you can even do that sort of in verbalizations, right? In call outs for people, in kudos for people, is to say, really highlight somebody who did sort of, step in and do some coverage and celebrate that. That is exactly culture, so I really appreciate that comment, Jesse. Yeah.
So maybe we want to just kind of transition into the last section, what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, so this is really a sense of a model for thinking about self-awareness as a leader, and it's kind of an invitation, and we may work more with this in the practice lab as well. You don't have to be a leader for this. You can do this just sort of within your own life, right? Like to cultivate self-awareness. The idea being self-awareness is the bedrock around emotional intelligence. And so if we can build our self-awareness, we build our emotional intelligence. And self-awareness can be expanded by building out what in this 2x2 is this top left corner. So we all have things that we know about ourselves and other people know about us, because we're out there with it, right? Not just about our physical attributes, but about our personality characteristics, right? Who we are. We know about ourselves. Other people would describe us this way, right? If you say, like, how would you describe yourself? These are the top 3 things about me. That if you asked, 5 people closest to you, those Venn diagrams would overlap a lot. Their 3 things would probably be really close to your 3 things about you, because it's what you put out in the world and what other people know about you. So this is sort of the known space. And then we all have things that we keep a little bit hidden and private that we know about ourselves, but other people may not know about us, because this is, part of our persona mask, if you will. This is stuff that's really not shown to other people, but we do know about ourselves. And then we have things that other people know about us, but we may not know about ourselves. And these are our blind spots. and we all have them. And the way that we can open up, if we want to go to the next slide, the way that we can open up this part of the 2x2, if you will, to really expand this area and broaden our self-awareness is we have some shared discovery with other people. We ask for and we get feedback about things that we may be blind to. The way we can deepen this hidden area is through self-disclosure. And this has to do with that authenticity piece of compassionate leadership. So you probably don't want to drop it all the way down, right? Where you let all the details spill out all the time. That can feel like too much, and people can't, if you're in a leadership position, that it is helpful to have a little bit of a boundary there where people feel like, you know, there is somebody at the helm, there's somebody that is, you know, is reliable in that way. So you probably don't, as a leader, you probably don't want to drop that all the way down, but there is some self-disclosure and vulnerability in being authentic in that way. And then this final part of the 2x2 is stuff that other people don't know about us, and we don't even know about ourselves. And that is sort of a journey of self-discovery. So there's a lot of different ways to kind of deepen into that space, including therapy, including other contemplative practices where we can go deeper into that. It's a sort of a life's work, if you will, to sort of go into that bottom right part of the quadrant. But I present this because these are two areas, whether you're a leader or not, if you want to really expand in that capacity of self-awareness, gradually being able to disclose things about yourself and be vulnerable on your team can be really helpful. And then people can really start to see and know you in a way that actually facilitates them working for and with you. And then in this other piece is very hard for a lot of leaders to drop into that willingness to get feedback and see not what you think you put out into the world, but what you actually put out into the world, and help with those blind spots. And so a lot of leadership assessments, right, can be, I'm going to answer questions about myself as a leader, right, a DISC profile or something, versus something like a 360 evaluation where you're getting some information from other people, and that can really help to alleviate your blind spots. Even more effective with that is through conversation. So asking a couple of people who really you feel like there's enough trust there, there's enough psychological safety that they can dip into this. I don't think we have time to sort of move into this next part of what we had thought about sharing. So I think we can just end there with that invitation around building self-awareness as a function of compassionate leadership, and we can begin to explore some other of these concepts within the practice lab as well. Really be happy to take any final questions or comments in the chat as we move to the last couple of minutes we have together.
The chat or
Thank you so much.
microphone. People can turn their microphones on.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing any Q&As. While you are writing your questions, I will go over things to remember. And that is that claim your certificate, please, to be able to complete the program evaluation. It'll take just a moment and it'll be of great help to us. The activity code expires in 1 week. I'll share it with you once more. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. Feel free to reach out to me or our office if you have any questions. We'll be happy to be of assistance. And finally, after the webinar, we will email you the instructions on how to get your certificate and how to watch our recorded videos. These are the dates and titles of our upcoming mindful practice and communication sessions. And the activity code, it's in front of you. Now, let's see if we have any questions. Now, I do not see any questions, but maybe Tina and John want to share something with us.
I really, I thank you for the comments. I'd love to see Heidi's comment of just kind of this opportunity to reflect around somebody that she works with. In that sense, you know, Heidi, I think you've just summarized it so well. I feel lucky to work with her. Like, you feel lucky to have her. So this idea that being a compassionate leadership means that things aren't going to get done is such a myth, that it actually generates this quality, right, of feeling lucky to work with somebody. That's the leader that you're going to show up for. That's a leader that you're going to stick with and do your best for. So I think you've summed it up beautiful, Heidi. Thanks.
So great.
We will see you next week. We're excited to do the practice lab with you. It'll be really interactive. I don't think we're going to have any slides. We're going to have some handouts for you to work on together separately. And will be a little bit different than our other practice labs. So come, bring your thinking cap, bring your engagement, your energy, your coffee and breakfast, and looking forward to next week.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Now you have completed the session and you may disconnect. Bye, everyone.